I always thought rhetoric was about like speeches, giving speeches or like writing those really persuasive essays. But then I read I.A. Richards.
Yeah.
And it totally like changed my perspective.
Yeah, he kind of blew up that idea, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we're going to be looking at today.
Right.
We're doing a deep dive into his book, Philosophy of Rhetoric.
Excellent book.
And to help us unpack some of this stuff,
sure,
we have some commentary by Dr. Bobby.
Yes, always, always helpful.
So it's not just us riffing on these ideas.
No.
We've got like an expert's perspective.
Absolutely. And what's really cool is that even though Richards was writing, a while ago,
yeah,
his ideas about communication and meaning, they're still so relevant today, even with like all the new ways we have to communicate.
Right. Like we've got so many more ways to communicate now than we did back then.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
To just jump right in, Richards basically says right at the beginning, forget about fancy speeches. Rhetoric is really about understanding and overcoming miscommunication, period.
He really cuts to the chase there, doesn't he?
Yeah, and he says it's not just like with the formal stuff. It applies to any communication.
That's key. That's a key distinction. He's really broadening the scope of how we think about rhetoric. And it's interesting, too, how that reflects a shift within academia. Dr. Bobby points out that, years ago, rhetoric was seen as a niche field. Kind of low status, even.
Really? Like it was just in a corner of the English department.
Exactly. Like nobody paid much attention to it. But then, you have this whole situation with freshman comp being required in most universities.
Right.
So now rhetoric and composition, they're essential and even profitable for these institutions.
That's an interesting point. So does Dr. Bobby talk about like where he sees things going? Like is rhetoric going to stay in English departments or branch out on its own?
He does, actually. He lays out two possibilities. Coexistence, where rhetoric stays within English departments, which he seems to prefer, or a split where we see the creation of like separate writing programs.
Interesting. I'll have to think about that. But back to Richard's point about miscommunication.
Sure.
I mean, think about how often you experience that in your daily life. It's practically unavoidable.
It really is, and that's why Richards is so valuable. He gives us the tools to understand why those breakdowns occur in the first place.
Okay, so where does Richard say we go wrong? Like, how do we start to create those breakdowns, those miscommunications?
He points to what he calls the proper meaning superstition.
Oh, wow. What's that?
It's this assumption that words have fixed, inherent meanings that everyone understands the same way.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been guilty of that at some point. Like, you get into an argument with someone, it's like, no, that's not what that word means.
Right, like somehow your dictionary is the ultimate authority. But the reality is, language doesn't really work that way.
No, it definitely doesn't.
So Richards is arguing that words are much more like shapeshifters.
Ooh, I like that.
Their meaning changes depending on the context.
Which makes sense, right? It's so much more realistic. But what about all the new ways we communicate now? Like, we're in this tech-driven world. Does Dr. Bobby talk about how that fits in?
He does, and it's a great point. Dr. Bobby suggests that this proper meaning superstition, it doesn't just apply to words anymore. It affects every element of communication. Emojis, images, sounds, even silence.
Wow. So we could be communicating without even using words.
Exactly.
And still run into the same trap of assuming everyone understands what we mean.
Exactly. That's a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so how do we eject falling into that trap? How do we, deal with all this shifting meaning?
Well, Richards offers a pretty straightforward answer.
Okay, I'm listening.
He says, context is key.
Context is key.
He argues that the meaning of a word can change completely based on who's saying it, how they're saying it, and the overall situation.
Okay, but do you have a concrete example of that? I'm all about real-world stuff to make it really click.
Sure. Dr. Bobby uses this really cool example from the video game Castlevania, Symphony of the Night. There are these two characters, Alucard and Maria, and they're both searching for someone named Belmont.
Okay, so they're both looking for the same guy.
Right, but the name Belmont triggers totally different memories and meanings for each of them because of their personal history with the Belmont family.
Oh, I see. So it's the same word, but it's carrying, a whole different weight.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates how an individual's experience shapes their interpretation.
Wow. That's a great example. It really drives home that this isn't just some abstract theory. It affects how we communicate every day. Think about a phrase as simple as, that's cool. It can mean so many different things depending on who's saying it and the situation.
It totally can. And Richards takes this idea even further by exploring the relationship between thought and action. He even suggests that thought and action can actually challenge our observations of the world.
Wait, hold on. I'm intrigued. But how can thought and action challenge our observations.
He uses this example of thinking about a cat versus thinking about a dog. We can all feel a difference, right?
Yeah, like in our minds, yeah.
Right, but Richard says, neurologists can't actually measure a difference, at least not yet.
That's wild. So does Dr. Bobby have any thoughts on this?
He does. He points out that while Richard's view of thought and action is a great starting point, we also need to consider things like motive. Our intentions play a huge role in how our communication is received.
So it's not just what we say, but why we say it, right?
Exactly. It all ties back to how our thoughts and intentions influence the meaning we put into words and how other people interpret them.
Okay, I'm really starting to see the complexity of this. It's more than just the words themselves. But before we get too far down the rabbit hole, I'm really curious about how Dr. Bobby updates Richard's ideas for today's world.
Yes. You're talking about that whole words as elements and meaning as impressions thing, right?
Yes, that really stuck with me.
Great. Well, let's dig into that after a quick break.
I'm ready.
Yeah, it really is a whole new way of thinking about communication, right? Instead of getting hung up on, the dictionary definition of a word.
Right.
We can start thinking about it as this, ongoing process where we're creating impressions.
Yeah, and acknowledging that meaning can change depending on all these different factors.
Exactly. And just acknowledging that is a huge step towards being more aware of how we communicate.
So how do we actually put this into practice? How do we avoid those miscommunications that Richard's talked about?
Well, Richards offers a few practical tips. The first one is to pay close attention to the words we choose and how they might be interpreted by other people.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially when we know that the same word can mean different things to different people.
Exactly, which brings us back to context.
Right, context is key.
It's not just about the words themselves, it's about who's saying them, how they're saying them, and the whole situation.
Got it. So word choice and context. What else does Richard say?
Feedback.
Oh, feedback, yeah. He emphasizes the importance of getting feedback from others to make sure we're actually communicating what we intend to communicate. It's so easy to think you're being clear when you're really not.
Totally. And it's not just about giving feedback, it's also about being open to receiving feedback, even if it's not what you want to hear.
Yeah, I could see how that would be tough but important.
It is. It's a skill, but it's essential for growth as a communicator.
So feedback. Got it. It doesn't have to be a formal thing, right?
No, not at all. It can be as simple as asking a friend, hey, did that make sense? Or what did you get from that?
I like that. Nice and easy. Okay, so we've got word choice, context, feedback. What does Dr. Bobby say about how all of this applies to rhetoric and composition today, especially with so much communication happening online now?
That's a great question, and it's where things get really exciting. Dr. Bobby reminds us that Richard's ideas aren't limited to spoken or written language. They apply to any form of communication.
Right, because we're communicating through images, videos, emojis, all sorts of stuff.
Exactly. It's like a whole new language has emerged. And Dr. Bobby challenges us to think about how to use these new tools effectively and ethically.
So it's not just about avoiding misunderstandings, it's also about being responsible with these new forms of communication.
Precisely. I think Richards would be fascinated to see how his ideas are being applied in the digital age.
Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners today? What can they actually apply to their own lives?
The biggest takeaway, I think, is this. Meaning is fluid. It's not fixed or absolute.
So we can't assume that everyone understands things the way we do.
Right. We need to be mindful of our word choices, the context, and the potential for misinterpretations.
And we need to be proactive about getting feedback and open to hearing it, even if it's not what we want to hear.
Absolutely. And remember, these principles apply to all forms of communication, not just written or spoken language.
So whether we're sending an email, posting on social media, or just having a conversation, we need to be aware of the power of rhetoric and the potential for misunderstandings.
That's the key. And by understanding these principles, we can become more effective communicators and better critical thinkers overall.
I'm loving this. It's like we're seeing communication with fresh eyes.
I know, it's pretty cool, right?
So are we ready for the final part of this deep dive?
I think so. Let's jump in and see what other gems Richards has in store for us.
All right, so before we wrap up our deep dive into Ira Richards and his philosophy of rhetoric, there was something that Dr. Bobby mentioned that I thought was super relevant, especially for us today.
You mean about how Richard's ideas about words and meaning can be expanded to all kinds of communication, not just spoken or written word?
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, Richards couldn't have predicted the internet or social media or emojis or anything like that, but somehow his ideas are even more important now.
It's true. It's like he was ahead of his time. When we start thinking of words as these broader elements of communication, and meaning as, well, not like a set thing, but like a process, a process of creating impressions. Suddenly, Richard's theories are like a roadmap for understanding communication in the digital age.
That's a great way to put it, a roadmap. And think about it, emojis, GIFs, even the way we curate our online profiles, it all contributes to the meaning we're trying to get across.
And just like words can be misunderstood, so can all of those other elements. Like a heart emoji can mean a whole bunch of different things depending on who sends it and who receives it. Even cultural differences can play a role.
It really makes you think about how careful we have to be, no matter what we're using to communicate.
Oh, absolutely. Richards was a huge advocate for being mindful about communication, recognizing that misunderstandings can happen and actively trying to bridge that gap.
So what's the big takeaway here for our listeners, especially for those who are trying to navigate all the complexities of communicating online?
Well, a few things come to mind. First, think about all the different elements you're using to communicate. Just like you would choose your words carefully, think about the emojis you're using or the images you're sharing. Everything sends a message.
And don't forget about context, like we said before. Even a wink can mean different things depending on who's doing the winking.
Exactly. A heart emoji from your best friend means something different than a heart emoji from, someone you just met online. And finally, be open to feedback. Don't be shy about asking, hey, did you get what I meant by that? Or what did you think of that emoji?
It's like that two-way street we talked about. Communication is a shared responsibility.
Right. It's about working together to create meaning. I think Richards would be happy to see how we're applying his ideas today.
Me too. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into Ian Richards and his philosophy of rhetoric. It's been an amazing journey, exploring the ins and outs of rhetoric, meaning, and how we communicate in this crazy, ever-changing world.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. We hope you found some, useful insights to take with you.
And as always, keep those minds curious and keep those communication skills sharp. We'll see you next time.